The moment my CEO asked me why I wrote that letter, I knew the secret I had hidden for months was no longer mine to protect. I remember standing outside Victoria Hayes's office with my heart racing, holding my laptop like it could somehow hide the mistake I had made. I was 39 years old, a senior project manager at one of the largest technology companies in Boston, and I had built my entire career around being careful. I checked every detail. I planned every meeting. I never allowed emotions to interfere with my work. But one forgotten email draft had changed everything. The letter was never supposed to leave my computer. It was something I wrote during a difficult night when I needed to put my feelings somewhere safe. It was not meant to be sent. It was not meant to be read. Especially not by Victoria Hayes, the woman whose name appeared at the top of my company's organizational chart. My CEO, the woman everyone described as brilliant, untouchable, and impossible to truly know. A few months earlier, my life had looked completely different. After my divorce, I moved into a smaller apartment, rebuilt my routine, and convinced myself that focusing on work was enough. I told myself I did not need anything else. I did not need new beginnings. I did not need to take emotional risks. I just needed stability. Then Victoria entered my thoughts in a way I never expected. It started with small moments. The way she remembered details from team meetings. The way she stayed late when others needed support. The way she listened carefully, even in a room full of executives. Everyone saw the CEO, the person making decisions worth millions of dollars. But I saw small moments nobody else seemed to notice. I saw a woman who carried the weight of being responsible for everyone. That was why I wrote the letter. Not because I expected anything to happen. I wrote it because I needed to admit the truth to myself. I wrote about how inspiring she was. How she reminded me that strength did not mean never feeling tired. How watching her rebuild the company after difficult years made me believe I could rebuild myself too. Then, somehow, that private letter ended up in the wrong email folder. One click. One mistake. One moment I could never take back. When I received the message saying, "Please come to my office immediately," I felt the world around me become strangely quiet. I imagined every possible outcome. Losing my position. Facing an uncomfortable conversation. Watching the respect I had built disappear. I walked through the glass hallway toward Victoria's office, seeing my reflection in the windows. I looked like the same professional woman everyone knew. Calm. Prepared. In control. But inside I was terrified. Victoria's assistant opened the door and quietly said, "She is waiting for you." I stepped inside and saw Victoria standing near her desk, holding a printed copy of the letter. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked the one question I never expected to hear. "Claire, why did you write this?" And suddenly I realized this was not about a mistake. This was about a truth I had spent months trying to hide. For a few seconds after Victoria asked me why I wrote the letter, I forgot how to breathe. I had prepared myself for anger. I had prepared myself for disappointment. I had prepared myself to hear that I had crossed a professional boundary, and that my future at the company would never be the same. But I had not prepared myself for curiosity. I looked at the printed pages in her hand and then back at her face. "I did not mean to send it," I said quietly. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. Victoria placed the letter on her desk. "I know that." Her answer surprised me. "Then why am I here?" I asked. She walked toward the window overlooking downtown Boston. The city lights reflected across the glass, and for the first time, I noticed how tired she looked. Not weak. Not uncertain. Just human. "Because I read something in that letter that I have not heard in a very long time," she said. Honesty. I did not know how to respond. Honesty was the one thing I thought had ruined everything. But Victoria seemed to see it differently. "Claire, you wrote about leadership. You wrote about resilience. You wrote about believing someone could rebuild after losing everything." She paused. "But you also wrote about yourself." My heart sank because I knew exactly what she meant. I had written about how seeing someone like Victoria continue forward after challenges inspired me. I had written about how I wanted to find that same strength inside myself. I had never intended for anyone to know those thoughts existed. "I am sorry," I said. "I should not have written something so personal about someone at work." Victoria looked at me and gently shook her head. "Do not apologize for having feelings. The words stayed with me. Not because they changed the situation, because they changed the way I saw myself. After my divorce, I had spent years believing that emotions were weaknesses. I thought needing someone meant I was failing. I thought starting over at 39 meant I had somehow fallen behind. But standing there, in the office of the most powerful person in the company, I realized I had been carrying the wrong idea about strength. Victoria returned to her desk and picked up the letter again. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded. "Why did you think nobody would ever see you the way you described me?" The question caught me completely off guard. I looked down because I did not have an easy answer. "Because I am used to being the person who supports everyone else," I finally said. After my divorce, I stopped believing someone would choose me. The room became quiet. Victoria did not immediately respond. She simply looked at me with an expression I had never seen from her before. Understanding. "I know that feeling," she said softly. I looked up. "You do." She smiled slightly. "More than you realize." In that moment, something changed. I walked into Victoria Hayes's office expecting judgment. Instead, I found a conversation between two women who had both spent years pretending they were stronger than they felt. And as I left her office that day, I had one question I could not stop thinking about. Why did my CEO seem to understand my heart better than anyone else ever had? After leaving Victoria's office, I expected to feel relieved. I thought the worst part was over. I thought once she understood that the letter was an accident, everything would return to normal. But normal no longer felt the same. The conversation stayed in my mind long after I left the building. Not because I was worried about my job. Not because I was embarrassed about the letter anymore. It was because Victoria had looked at me differently. Not as an employee. Not as someone who made a mistake. She looked at me like she understood the person behind the professional image I showed everyone else. For the next few days, I tried to focus on my work. I returned to my usual schedule, attended meetings, reviewed project updates, and acted like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Victoria started including me in conversations more often. She asked for my thoughts during meetings instead of only requesting updates. She remembered small details about my ideas. She listened. Those simple actions affected me more than I wanted to admit. I had worked with many executives throughout my career, but I had never met someone who made me feel seen in that way. A week later, Victoria asked me to join her on a new company project. It was a major initiative that required someone who understood both the technical details and the people behind the work. I was surprised when she chose me. "Are you sure I am the right person for this?" I asked during our first planning meeting. Victoria looked up from the documents in front of her. "Yes, Claire." I would not have asked if I was not sure. There was confidence in her voice, but there was also something warmer. Something personal. Working closely with Victoria showed me a side of her that most employees never experienced. She was not the distant CEO people imagined. She stayed late reviewing plans. She thanked everyone who contributed. She remembered when someone on the team was having a difficult week. She carried responsibility quietly, without asking anyone to notice. One evening after a long meeting, we stayed in the conference room while the rest of the office became empty. The city outside the windows was glowing, and Boston felt unusually peaceful. "Can I tell you something?" Victoria asked. I smiled slightly. "After everything that happened, I think you can tell me anything." She laughed softly. It was a sound I rarely heard from her at work. "Most people think becoming successful means you stop feeling uncertain," she said. "They think confidence means never questioning yourself." I listened carefully. But that is not true. She looked at the empty conference table. Sometimes the more responsibility you have, the harder it becomes to admit when you need someone. Her words felt familiar because I understood them. After my divorce, I had built walls around myself. I became independent because I had to. But somewhere along the way, independence became isolation. "I think we are both better at taking care of other people than ourselves," I said. Victoria looked at me and smiled. "I think you might be right." That moment was small. Nothing dramatic happened. No promises were made. But something important shifted between us. The woman I once saw only as my CEO was becoming someone I wanted to understand. And the more I discovered about Victoria Hayes, the more I wondered if the letter I accidentally sent was not a mistake after all. Maybe it was the beginning of a conversation we both needed. The strange thing about getting to know Victoria was that the more I saw the real person behind the title, the harder it became to remember the distance I was supposed to keep. She was still my CEO. I was still an employee. Those facts had not changed. But something between us had quietly shifted, and I could feel it every time we worked together. The project became the center of our days. We spent long hours reviewing ideas, meeting with teams, and solving challenges together. At first, I thought the closeness would make things uncomfortable. Instead, it revealed a connection I never expected. Victoria noticed things about me that others overlooked. She remembered that I preferred quiet spaces when I needed to think. She noticed when I skipped lunch because I was too focused on a deadline. She reminded me that taking care of myself was not the same as being less committed. Those small moments meant more than grand gestures ever could. After years of feeling invisible, being understood felt unfamiliar. One Friday evening, we stayed late at the office to prepare for an important presentation. Most of the building was empty, and the usual noise of meetings and conversations had disappeared. The quiet made everything feel more honest. Victoria looked through the final documents and then suddenly asked, "Can I ask you something personal?" I hesitated, but I nodded. "Why did you stop believing you deserved something good?" Her question caught me completely off guard. I looked down at the papers in front of me because I did not know how to answer without admitting how much I had changed after my divorce. "I think I got used to disappointment," I finally said. "After a while, you start protecting yourself before anything can hurt you." Victoria was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I understand that more than you know." It was the first time she opened a door into her own life. She told me that success had come with a cost. People respected her position, but very few people knew her beyond it. Everyone wanted something from the CEO. Very few people asked how Victoria was actually doing. Hearing that made me realize we were not as different as I once thought. We were both women who had learned how to appear strong because life had given us reasons to be careful. The next week, something unexpected happened. During a company meeting, a difficult decision had to be made about the project timeline. Several executives disagreed with my approach, but Victoria asked me to explain my reasoning. She listened while everyone else waited. When the discussion ended, she supported my plan. Later that day, she stopped by my office. "Thank you for trusting your own judgment," she said. I smiled. "Thank you for trusting it too." For a moment, neither of us said anything. There was a quiet understanding between us that felt impossible to explain. But I knew one thing. The letter that had once felt like my biggest mistake had become the reason I discovered a side of Victoria nobody else saw. And slowly, I was beginning to wonder if she was discovering a side of me that I had forgotten existed. The more time I spent working with Victoria, the more difficult it became to pretend she was only my CEO. I still respected the boundaries between us. Still reminded myself that our positions were different. But there were moments when the distance between professional respect and personal connection became harder to define. It happened in small ways. A conversation after a meeting. A shared laugh during a stressful afternoon. A quiet moment when neither of us felt the need to fill the silence. I started noticing things about Victoria that nobody else seemed to see. She always arrived early, but she was often the last person to leave. She remembered every important detail about the people around her, yet she rarely talked about herself. She carried the expectations of an entire company, as if asking for help was something she had forgotten how to do. One evening, after another long day preparing for the project launch, Victoria and I walked through the nearly empty office together. The city lights outside the windows reflected against the glass walls, making the entire floor feel peaceful. "Do you ever miss who you were before everything changed?" she asked. The question surprised me because it was exactly the question I had been asking myself for years. "Sometimes," I answered. "I miss the person who believed life could still surprise me." Victoria looked thoughtful. "Maybe that person is still there." Her words stayed with me. After my divorce, I had convinced myself that starting over meant accepting a smaller version of my life. I stopped expecting excitement. I stopped believing someone could truly understand me. But Victoria had a way of making me question those beliefs. She never tried to fix me. She simply reminded me that I was still becoming someone new. A few days later, we attended a company event together. It was the first time I saw Victoria outside the controlled environment of the office. Everyone approached her because of her position, but I noticed how carefully she listened to every person who spoke with her. She remembered names. She asked about families. She made people feel important. On the way home, she surprised me by admitting something. "People think being a CEO means you always know what to do," she said. "The truth is, sometimes I am just trying to make the best choice with the information I have." I smiled. That sounds more human than I expected. She laughed softly. "Maybe that is because everyone sees the title before they see the person." That sentence stayed with me because it explained everything. Victoria was surrounded by people every day. Yet she was still searching for someone who could see beyond the title. And somehow my accidental honesty had created a space where she felt safe enough to be real. But as our connection grew stronger, I became aware of something that scared me. I was no longer just grateful for her kindness. I was starting to care about her happiness. I wanted to know when she was having a difficult day. I wanted to hear her thoughts. I wanted to see the person behind the success. And the most surprising part was realizing that Victoria seemed to want the same thing from me. For the first time in years, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was wondering what might still be possible. For the first time in a long while, I stopped asking myself what could go wrong and started wondering what could go right. That feeling was unfamiliar. After my divorce, I had trained myself to expect disappointment before happiness. Felt safer that way. If I never hoped for too much, I could never lose too much. But Victoria had slowly changed something inside me. She reminded me that life did not end after a painful chapter. Sometimes it simply waited for us to begin again. The closer we became, the more I noticed the little things that made Victoria different from the person everyone else saw. She was still the confident CEO who could walk into a room and command attention. But outside those moments, she was someone who enjoyed quiet conversations, old movies, and simple evenings without expectations. One night, while we were reviewing the final details of our project, Victoria looked at the clock and realized we had been working for hours. "You always forget to take a break," she said. I smiled. "I could say the same about you." She laughed, and for a moment the pressure of our roles disappeared. We were just two women sitting across from each other, sharing a moment that felt surprisingly normal. Then, Victoria became quiet. "Claire, can I ask you something about the letter?" My expression changed immediately. Even though weeks had passed, the memory still carried weight. "Of course," I said. She looked at the document beside her. "When you wrote that I inspired you, did you mean it?" I almost smiled because I thought she already knew the answer. "Yes," I said. "But not because you are the CEO." Victoria looked curious. "Then why?" I took a breath. "Because you showed me that starting over does not mean your story is over." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Victoria looked away, and I noticed a sadness in her expression that I had never seen before. "I used to think I had everything I wanted," she said. "A successful company, financial security, respect. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to let people know me." Her honesty surprised me. Victoria Hayes, the woman everyone admired, was admitting that success had left her feeling disconnected. "I think people assume strong people do not need anyone," I said. She nodded slowly. "That is exactly what people assume." That was the first time Victoria told me something personal about her past. Years earlier, she had chosen her career over relationships because she believed there was no room for both. She built a life that looked perfect from the outside, but she rarely allowed herself to experience the kind of connection she secretly wanted. Hearing that changed the way I saw her. The CEO who seemed impossible to reach was actually someone who had been protecting herself for the same reasons I had. We were not two completely different people. We were two women who had learned how to survive by hiding parts of ourselves. Later that evening, as I walked home through the streets of Boston, I thought about everything that had happened since the accidental email. I realized the letter had revealed more than my feelings. It had revealed a truth about both of us. We were both waiting for permission to be honest. And maybe the most unexpected part was this. The person I was afraid would judge me was the person who finally helped me understand myself. The week after Victoria opened up about her past, everything between us felt different. Not because something dramatic had happened. There was no single moment that changed everything. It was quieter than that. It was in the way we looked at each other during meetings. It was in the way conversations continued even after the work was finished. It was in the comfort of knowing that someone finally understood the parts of me I had kept hidden for years. But with that closeness came a fear I could not ignore. Victoria was my CEO. No matter how much we connected, that reality remained. I knew the world would not see two people who understood each other. They would see a complicated situation. They would see a position of power. They would question intentions before they ever considered emotions. I tried to convince myself that creating distance was the responsible choice. I started keeping conversations shorter. I stopped staying late after meetings. I focused only on work. I thought I was protecting both of us. But Victoria noticed. She always noticed. One afternoon after a project meeting, she asked me to stay for a moment. The office was almost empty, and I immediately knew she understood something had changed. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. The question surprised me because I expected her to be confident, not uncertain. "No," I answered quickly. "You did nothing wrong." She looked at me carefully. "Then why does it feel like you are trying to disappear?" I looked away because I did not know how to explain it without admitting how much I cared. "Because this is complicated," I finally said. "You are my CEO. I am your employee. People could misunderstand." Victoria nodded slowly. "You are right. It is complicated." For a moment I thought she would agree that distance was the best answer. Instead she continued, "But pretending something meaningful does not exist does not make it disappear." Her words stayed with me. I knew she was right, but I was still afraid. Not of Victoria. Not of my feelings. I was afraid of losing the life I had rebuilt. After my divorce, I had worked hard to become independent again. I had created a stable career. I had learned how to stand on my own. The idea of risking that stability felt overwhelming. A few days later, the situation became even more difficult. A rumor started circulating in the company about how closely Victoria and I had been working together. Nothing inappropriate had happened, but I knew how quickly assumptions could spread. I watched people whisper in hallways and exchange uncertain looks. Suddenly, the connection that had brought so much comfort also brought pressure. I decided to request a transfer away from the project. When I told Victoria, she became quiet. "Is this what you really want?" she asked. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe leaving was easier, but the truth was harder. "No," I admitted. "It is just what feels safest." Victoria looked at me with sadness in her eyes. "Claire, sometimes protecting yourself means you also protect yourself from happiness." That sentence followed me long after I left her office, because deep down I knew she was right. I had spent years avoiding pain, but now I had to decide whether fear was going to control the rest of my story. After I requested the transfer, I thought I would finally feel peaceful. I thought creating distance would make everything easier. I thought if I removed myself from the situation, the confusion would disappear and I could return to the simple life I had built. But the truth was, leaving did not bring relief. It only made me realize how much Victoria had become part of my everyday world. The office felt different without our conversations. Meetings felt quieter. Even small moments like seeing a project update and wanting to know what Victoria would think reminded me that I had not simply walked away from a job. I had walked away from someone who had helped me see myself differently. A few days later, Victoria asked me to meet outside the office. We sat in a small coffee shop near Boston Common, away from the company building and all the expectations attached to it. For the first time, we were not CEO and employee. We were just Victoria and Claire. "I wanted to talk to you without the walls around us," she said. I smiled slightly because I understood exactly what she meant. The walls had never only been the office walls. They were the fears we both carried. "I know why you stepped back," Victoria continued, "and I respect that." I looked at her surprised. "You do?" She nodded. "Because I know what it feels like to choose safety over happiness." That was the moment I realized Victoria was not trying to convince me. She was not asking me to ignore reality. She was simply showing me that I had a choice. We talked for a long time that afternoon. We talked about the rumors, the responsibilities, and the reasons we were both afraid. Victoria admitted something I never expected. Years earlier, she had ended a meaningful relationship because she believed her career had to come first. She told herself that success would eventually fill every empty space. But it did not. "I spent so much time building a life everyone admired," she said quietly. "I forgot to build one I actually wanted." Her honesty stayed with me. For years I had thought my divorce was the moment my life changed forever. But maybe it was only the moment when I started becoming someone new. Maybe losing what I thought I needed created space for something I never expected. The next morning I made a decision. I would not return to the project because of Victoria. I would return because I deserved to stand beside people who believed in my abilities. I would stop making choices based only on fear. When I told Victoria, she smiled. "That sounds like the Claire I first saw in that letter." I laughed softly. "The woman who accidentally revealed too much?" "The woman who was honest," she corrected. That answer meant more than she knew. Because for so long I believed honesty was dangerous. I believed showing my heart gave other people the power to hurt me. But Victoria taught me something different. The right person does not use your vulnerability against you. The right person respects it. As we continued working together, we made sure everything remained professional and clear. We understood the importance of trust and respect. But we also stopped pretending that the connection between us was meaningless. The biggest surprise was not discovering that I had feelings for Victoria. It was discovering that I was finally brave enough to admit what I wanted. And for the first time in years, I was not rebuilding my life because something had fallen apart. I was building it because something beautiful had begun. Months later, I often think about the day everything changed. Not because of the mistake I made, but because of what that moment revealed. Before that day, I believed my life had already been decided. I thought my best years were behind me. I thought starting over at 39 meant accepting a quieter, smaller version of happiness. But I was wrong. Sometimes the moments we fear the most are the ones that open the door to something we never imagined. Victoria and I continued building our relationship slowly and carefully. We understood that trust was not created by one conversation. It was created through consistency, honesty, and respect. We continued to protect the professionalism we both valued, but we also stopped pretending that our connection was something we needed to hide from ourselves. Outside the office, I discovered more about the woman behind the CEO title. Victoria loved peaceful mornings, handwritten notes, and walks through the city when she needed time to think. She was still ambitious and determined, but she no longer carried every responsibility alone. She allowed herself to be supported, and that changed everything. I also changed. I stopped measuring my worth by what I could do for others. I started taking photographs again, not because it was part of my job, but because it reminded me who I was before life convinced me to become someone else. Victoria always encouraged that part of me. She told me that my ability to notice beauty in ordinary moments was one of the things she admired most. One evening, we stood outside the company building after a long day. The Boston streets were quiet, and the lights reflected on the pavement around us. Victoria looked at me and smiled. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that letter had never reached me?" I thought about it for a moment. Maybe we both would have continued pretending we were fine. She nodded because we both knew it was true. The letter did not create our connection. It simply revealed something that was already there. It showed two women who had spent years being strong for everyone else finally allowing themselves to be honest. Looking back, I do not remember that day as the day I made a mistake. I remember it as the day I stopped hiding. I learned that love does not always arrive in a perfect moment. Sometimes it arrives unexpectedly, through a situation we never planned, and asks us to be brave enough to listen. Victoria taught me that success means nothing if you have nobody to share your life with. I learned that healing does not mean forgetting the past. It means allowing yourself to believe the future can still be beautiful. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with someone who believes in second chances. Because every story of healing reminds us that it is never too late to find connection, courage, and a love that feels like home.